Hello, hello, hello. How's it going, everybody? Wanted to make a quick video. I'm just video crazy with both channels in the past little bit. But I wanted to talk a little bit about somebody I've been meaning to for a while, Joe Matt, and kind of a few thoughts on him and what his comics, what impact his work has had on my kind of comic reading experience. This was brought on by Earl Grey. Was kind enough to do a very flattering video showing off a bunch of stuff that I got him, which is neither here nor there. But the point is that in the comments section there was comments about Joe Matt, and Earl Grey had mentioned that he had just heard a podcast talking about Joe Matt, and that one of the guys that was kind of discussing his work knew him and Seth and Chester Brown back when they were kind of more prolific, I guess. Not that some of them aren't anymore. Joe Matt isn't and hasn't been for about 10 years, I guess, is what they were saying. But kind of in their heyday, I suppose, of being the Toronto Three. And that, if you do want to hear that, I highly recommend it. Really, really interesting talk, some really good points, and just a perspective that we'll discuss a little bit. But it's deconstructingcomics.com, and it's episode number 452. It's called Joe Matt's The Poor Bastard, and it was posted on May 25th, 2015. You can also find Deconstructing Comics podcasts on iTunes. I had a quick look and saw a bunch there, but went to the website to kind of pinpoint exactly which episode it was. So these are Drawn and Quarterly magazine kind of anthologies. I believe this is 1991. October 1990 is this one. So this is issue number 2. And these are, I only have a few. I think at one point I had more, but have since, I'm not sure what happened to the rest of them. These I bought when they came out. I was reading these, and I remember vividly bringing some of these to school to read, as well as these two. I brought these up because I thought that they had some Joe Matt in them as well, but they don't. This is a Fantagraphics magazine anthology that I really loved at the time as well too. But these Drawn and Quarterlies were Canadian. This one has Fulbert Sturgeon, Richard Sala, Joe Matt, Carol Moiswich, Andy Bernstein, etc. Carol Taylor, Julie Doucette, Daniel Clowes, and this one Joe Sacco, Roberta Gregory, etc., etc. And they were, as with all of them, they're hit and miss. But these ones stood out, and the reason I kept picking them up, honestly, was specifically for Joe Matt's work. I'd always been a Crumb fan, and to a further extent, at this time especially, I was really gaining interest in kind of a little more autobiographical type comics. His strips just read really different to me, as much as it was kind of him in there and he was injecting some of his thoughts. There was things like this where he's talking about a dream that he had where he kind of sees Jesus Christ appears to him and John Lennon and stuff, quacking with Kevin, talking. I guess him and a friend of his had a period where they were talking like Donald Duck and what dirty kind of things they would do to Minnie Mouse and that sort of thing. And then it would jump to something like this, where it was a story with people from his life. And even more telling at the bottom there, Are you still doing comics? Hey, that reminds me. Are you still drawing me fat, you son of a bitch? Where he hasn't really in the rest of the strip, just all of a sudden he does there. Uh, what to say about that? I mean, it appealed to me. Everything is dated at the top there. I don't know if you can see May 17th, 1989. So it really, you had this sense of they were these journal entries. So there was a sense of truth to them for sure. And it's one of the things that I found interesting listening to the podcast. One of the guys had been reading Joe Matt since kind of Peep Show and this era. So he had a different take on it than the guy who had just read The Poor Bastard. And I found that fascinating because I kind of have this early exposure to Joe Matt. There's a sense for me, and I'm trying to figure out if it's throughout more autobiographical works of various people, if I see it as kind of some of the subject matter. I don't see it as disturbing. I see it as kind of, he's being brutally honest for sure, but like so many things that I love where it's kind of more autobiographical, Curb Your Enthusiasm is a perfect example. I see that, yes, sure, there's elements of Larry David in the character Larry David on the TV show, but those characteristics are kind of blown out of proportion and used as a basis to kind of jump off into other things. Now, that said, with Joe Matt, there was a couple of stories that they told where he really did have this. He gets into some of his books, he really gets into kind of his addiction with pornography and his views on women in general, and how he has this ideal in his head of my girlfriend has got to have this color hair, this color eyes, this shaped body, this big of an ass, these big of tits, that sort of thing. And he really has these kind of unhealthy expectations of not only for his life, but of what role the woman is going to fulfill in his life. And it really gets a little bit darker when he does talk about, like, very openly his addiction to pornography and getting two VHS tapes and just chronic masturbation, two VHS machines rather, so he could edit together his favorite scenes from his favorite pornos so he can just have this huge masturbation session. And again, I can completely understand how people would find some of that subject matter disturbing. And I'm not saying that I never do. It's a little bit cringeworthy at times, but there's still something, and I don't know if it's because it's presented in a comic book form. Excuse me, sorry, move the microphone here. I don't know if it's presented in this comic book format that there's a little bit of a distance there for me because it's a drawing of him, as opposed to if you see, again, Curb Your Enthusiasm or any other sort of documentary, or even to that degree reality TV, and maybe this is getting into territory of working in the film industry, knowing that things aren't always as they seem, even if you are watching a quote-unquote reality TV program. I still am very aware that stuff is amplified and there's stuff that's just outright, it's just lies and just bullshit, just presented in this format. So part of that always was, it read to me like that with Joe Matt's stuff. But listening to this podcast was a different side of it, as they talk about things like, here you can see Chester Brown and Seth in the top right panel here. So there's Seth there, and then there's Chester Brown there. And this is actually a strip from February 20th, 1991, or a journal entry where he first meets Seth, and the three of them become kind of friends. There was a point, apparently, where Chester Brown asked him to leave him out of his comics. He didn't feel comfortable being portrayed in his comics. And there's a story in the podcast of Seth getting really angry at one point as far as the way that Joe presented Seth in a strip that was just an outright lie. And that's where it kind of gets to that territory with me, that it seems like, sure, there's these moments that are based on really dark truths where he's really confronting himself, and you are reading this guy's journal. Speaking of Chester, there he is right there. But there's also a sense of blowing things out of proportion a little bit to explore and just kind of get a little bit of using a little bit of dramatic license, to make things up. There's no Joe Matt in this issue, but there is this ad for Peep Show #1 from Drawn and Quarterly. I've not ever seen these single issues before. Well, let's see what year this is. This looks like it's 1992, April 1992. I'd love to get some of those single issues. The other thing that they talked about in the podcast that sounds very appealing is the letters that he started getting in, and answering letters became increasingly hostile. And yeah, I mean, when you do this kind of work, especially when you're dealing with subject matter that's a little more controversial, you are opening yourself up to a lot of just hatred. I mean, how much hatred and disgust did Chester Brown open himself up to when he did Paying for It? I think it's a fantastic work. And showing a bravery to kind of talk so candidly, again, regardless of how much you take from it as being real or whatever, I honestly think is really beside the point. It doesn't ultimately matter if every last detail is real or not, or if he seems confused about a few things. There's some sort of looking into this person, the way that he's drawing his strips or writing a story, that you're reading so much more into it. I keep holding this one up because for me, this particular Playtime strip has always been one of my favorites, just for the composition of the page and everything, but also for the content, as far as you have now Joe Matt, August 28th, 1989, I think that says. It's kind of cut off up there, right up there. You probably can't see it on camera. You have him taking his character, and the first thing he says is, now what kind of weird strip do I have to go through? So he kind of runs him through this maze of all these kind of perils. He drops down and lands in water, gets into a car that races around a track, dumps him in a hole that he kind of crawls out of, and finally just sits still and says, I ain't moving, I don't even care, and this weight is going to drop on his head. So, I mean, stuff like that is also very telling, that he's really putting himself through the ringer as far as what he's portraying, but it's also it's still a comic strip, and he's still, I don't know, that there's still this distance, and whether that distance is him trying to distance himself from his character psychologically or subconsciously, or if it's just this is how he decided to do comics. Apparently in the podcast, they say that he did always want to kind of be a little more traditional cartoonist and have a character that he could write about, but it just never happened for him. They also mentioned this one in the podcast as well, How to Be Cheap. He's notoriously cheap, so he did this strip of things that you could do to be a little more frugal. Now, just to kind of jump off onto where he's been lately, I don't really know. They seem to talk about a lot of things in the podcast of him kind of making a complete change of his lifestyle. But his creativity just kind of came crashing to a halt, and has been that way for about 10 years. Whereas guys like Seth and Chester have just kept going and creating and putting out new work and making a career out of it. He just couldn't make the transition, which is unfortunate. I always found his stuff highly entertaining. Yeah, I mean, it really just takes a bravery to portray yourself in such a fucking horrible light sometimes. I mean, he just does not come off as a good person sometimes. And then it's just mixed with this character that is very comical sometimes, where sometimes you really like the guy and you kind of feel sorry, or I do anyway. I really like the guy that's portrayed here a lot of the times. And when those dark moments happen, I feel sorry for him. And I think that's an incredible thing to be able to do with some drawings on a page. It always seems like it's more it always seems like it's more of an accomplishment when you do something personal in this form to me, as opposed to something where it's a film and people can follow you through your day-to-day existence. I don't know why that is, but that's the way that it is. Um, if you haven't read any Joe Matt, I'd highly recommend picking something up. The Peep Show book that Earl Grey showed there is a real gem. It collects a lot of these stories. The stories that you see here are all collected in that volume, I believe. I just wanted to show you the actual magazine versions, how they first came out. Yeah, I say grab it, go for it, and just soak yourself into these, how many panels is that? That's like 40 panels on one page. Uh, it's really great stuff. Very entertaining. And if I didn't say it already, he kind of was the window to guys like Chester Brown and Seth when I saw them portrayed in his strips, and then for example, seeing ads for Palookaville in the back, Seth, and then discovering Seth and Chester. It was Joe Matt that introduced me to that whole world, and it's a real shame that he's not producing work nowadays. I would love to read more. I mean, yeah, I mean, he should have his due just as much as Chester and Seth do. So there. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and yeah, hunt down the Joe Matt that you can find and have a listen to that podcast to learn a little more. We'll talk to you.